Hello and welcome to another of our conversations about the forthcoming Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion Award, which is going to be made by the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain. We've been interviewing all 5 shortlistees, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome Anne-Francoise Morel, all the way from Belgium, and I hope we're going to find out a little bit more about her book. Anne-Francoise, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. So hello, I'm Anne-Francoise Morel, and I'm trained as an art historian at the University of Ghent in Belgium. And since 2015, I'm a professor in history and theory of architecture at the University of Leuven, also in Belgium. I represent my university on the Scientific Council of the Academia Belgica in Rome. And I'm a correspondent member of the Royal Society of Archaeology in Belgium. And I also am the International Engagement Officer of the Society of Architectural Historians Great Britain. Last year, I held the Belgian chair at the University of London, Birkbeck College. However, unfortunately, my stay was aborted due to the COVID pandemic. So I hope to be able to travel soon again to my beloved Britain. No surprise then that one of my major research interests focuses on early modern British architecture, which resulted, amongst others, into my first monograph, which we will discuss today. Besides my degree in architectural history, I also hold a degree in international politics. And together with some colleagues at the University of Leuven, I currently develop a second research line on Belgian diplomatic architecture.
Well, that's quite a portfolio. Thank you very much. Your book is called, and it's got a wonderful title, Glorious Temples or Babylonic Whores, the Culture of Church Building in Stuart, England through the Lens of Consecration Sermons. Now, once you've taken that on board, how did you come onto this topic and what was it about it that
thank you for the compliment on the title, first of all. It's actually one of the few sentences that didn't change over the publication process, I think. My editor, Ariane van Dijk at Brill, really asked me not to change the title, although his spam filter always caught my emails to him. So we actually had to change the email subject heading into the book instead of Glorious Temples, Babylonic Whores. But to be totally honest to you, the credits for the title are actually due to the Stuart preachers themselves, and more specifically to Jeremiah Dyke. Dyke was really vehemently opposed to Roman Catholic architecture and to the Roman Catholic Church. And in his consecration sermon, which he preached upon the occasion of the consecration of the chapel of Epping, he described the Roman Catholic Church as an apocalyptic whore. And if it's fine for you, I would like to quote from a sermon, because I really am fond of this passage, and it explains a lot about the book. So here it goes. The Roman Catholic Church is as an apocalyptic whore. She is decked with gold and precious stones, and so are her churches. Her images, her idols, all gloriously adorned to set forth an outward majesty to sense, full of abomination and the filthiness of her fornication. It's all about the whore's garish habit to catch the carnal eyes, unquote. And I think this quote, which is taken from one of the sermons, really tells a lot about the origins of the title. Regarding the origins of the book, well, they were actually inadvertently led during a research seminar ran by Caroline Van Eck and Maarten Delbeke, in which I participated as a student. And while most of my architectural history courses in Belgium focused on Italian and French architecture, and of course the architecture of the Low Countries, the British Isles and England remained rather out of scope. So when Caroline van Eck introduced me to the land of Albion, if I can say so, my curiosity grew into a fascination, the research paper into a PhD, and the PhD into this book. Regardless of the specificity of Stuart religious architecture, I am mostly not by the architectural object per se, but by what I would call the cultural history of architecture. I want to understand the cultural and the societal incentives which led to the genesis of a building project and which informed its design. The questions that trigger me are: what meaning does a building convey? And how does it convey it? And is this the intended meaning, the originally intended meaning? And how was the building received and perceived? What concerns informed the architectural thinking and design? So if I apply this to my book, Glorious Temple, I can say that I actually try to understand how churches were perceived from the religious point of view. So from the point of view of the church as an institution, from the point of view of the clergy and the worshipper. I study the buildings and the ideas on their necessity, their function and design within the context of the religious and the intellectual culture that surrounds them. So in other words, I examine the ideas on the status, the role, and the function of the church building in post-Reformation England, and how these ideas affected the architectural thinking and design. The Stuart period is a very interesting period to do this kind of exercise because it was actually the first time when clergy and architects alike have to think about the design of totally new built churches for the recently established Church of England. And this sometimes led to really impassionate debates, which of course form the core of my book.
Well, that's quite a full description, so thank you. I wonder now if my questions have all been answered. Let's look at consecration sermons. One might imagine what they are, but would you please explain a little bit about them, such as who gave them and what they said and how influential they were?
Well, first of all, it's important to notice that there was no set form of consecration, and that even the act of consecration a church or a chapel wasn't really required. So the consecration form or ritual was actually left to the bishop's own discretion. And over the course of the Stuart period, two of these forms became unofficial models, if I can say so. And they prescribed some biblical texts for the prayers, the psalms, and the lectures that had to be used in the consecration service. But they didn't make any provisions regarding the sermons. Although the sermon was one of the most important parts of the consecration ceremony, if I can say so. And so the content of the sermon was really left to, well, the initiative of the preacher, to the preacher's own initiative. And so it gave the preacher a lot of freedom to express his individual thoughts regarding church architecture. And so the content of the sermon preached could sometimes become very polemical. One has to understand that these sermons offer an accessible translation of some more obtuse doctrinal arguments, including the holiness of the church building, the debate between public and private worship, the use or the importance of sensory impressions in worship, and last but not least, the early Christian roots of the Church of England. So, in some cases, these sermons were also deliberately deployed into local controversies. There is, for instance, the case of St. John in Leeds, where in the morning the sermon was preached by a more Laudian preacher, and in the afternoon, the local Puritan preacher, Reverend Todd, really preached against the sermon that was preached in the morning.
Well, it would have been interesting to be living in those days. One would have to be very careful which side of the road on which one should walk. The subtitle of your book, The Culture of Church Building in Stuart, England. The time span you adopt, as I understand, goes up to the death of Nicholas Hawksmoor in 1736, which far exceeds the end of the Stuart period itself. By now, the Protestant Hanoverian dynasty was well established, and in fact, George II had been on the throne for over 10 years. So my question is, to what extent did the specifically Stuart culture of church building extend into the long Hanoverian era?
Well, first of all, it's important to notice that Nicholas Hawksmoor, whose year of death I used as the end date of the book. Well, Nicholas Hawksmoor was the architect of the 1711 church building campaign launched under Queen Anne. And from the beginning of his work in this church building campaign, Nicholas Hawksmoor was surrounded by a commission composed out of theologians, clergy, and antiquarians who really set the diary, if I can say so, or the program of Nicholas Hawksmoor's designs. And so when we read the Commission's advice, we see that a lot of their preoccupations, they go back to the preoccupations which were expressed through the whole Stuart period, and none in the least the idea that the Church of England was the only lawful church that had early Christian primitive roots. And so this idea is very important in the design of Nicholas Hawksmoor churches. He even made a drawing of the early Christian basilica, which you see in this video. And all these ideas continued into the 18th century as well. And finally, one should also be aware that, of course, some of these churches of the 1711 campaign were designed during the Stuart period, but they were only built, finished, and consecrated in the Georgian era. So it would have been a bit strange to stop the book at the death of Queen Anne. So I chose to take the death of the most important architect of the 1711 campaign as the terminus for the book.
I think it's one of the problems of architectural history to try to tie it into monastic dynasties, because it doesn't really work like that, nor does it tie into nicely rounded centuries. Although I do recall the introduction to John Summerson's George in London, the first chapter says that it is greatly convenient that George in London matched almost exactly the era of the four Georges and King William IV. Well, returning to the title of your book, the phrase is glorious temple. I had thought it refers to church building as a representation of godly magnificence, but I suspect I'm wrong with this. And you've given us quite a good description in that lovely quote of what a Babylonic whore might be when it comes to a church building. And you've mentioned this church in Leeds. I was wondering if you could cite one or two examples and sort of say where they fall, either into the Glorious Temple grouping or the Babylonic Whore grouping.
Mhm. Well, that's an obvious and also an excellent question, but probably the most difficult one to answer. In that period, the concept of good or bad church architecture not only relates to architectural design. On the contrary, it relates to a complex interaction between doctrine, liturgy, in particular the so-called adiaphora, worship, church history, and design. So every case should be approached, as I do in my book, with a particular need for caution and nuance. And that's why in my book I decided not to take the building as the point of departure, but rather the discourse surrounding it. And depending on the beholder's ideas, one and the same building could be perceived as a glorious temple or as a Babylonic whore, so as a representation of godly magnificence, or as an agent of deception and idolatry. And an interesting case in point is Exeter College Chapel in Oxford, of which you see an image right here. The sermon preached at the chapel's consecration by the Calvinist rector John Prideaux shows this tension. Prideaux regards the fast and the pomp of Herod's temple as an act of Satan, but on the other hand, he's in full admiration for the godly magnificence of the church buildings which were built under the Emperor Constantine. So the pomp and the magnificence can be both, in church architecture, can be at the same time something good or something bad, but depending on the context. Of course, there are also some more clear-cut examples, and one is St. Mary's, Southampton, consecrated in 1711. Unfortunately, we don't have a certain and clear image of that building, but I have a description dating from about the 1725, 1730s, so let's say 10, 15 years after the church's consecration. And in that description, the church is described as magnificent, expensively ornated, very big structure, and the local historian who describes this church even says that it's so big and so magnificent that at a certain point it could become a burden for the rather poor parish. When we read the 1711 consecration sermon, so written 10, 15 years earlier, the high church preacher Thomas Bis describes the churchly magnificence and the ornaments in a totally different way. And he actually preaches in favor of the construction of big, magnificent, and expensive churches. And I quote him, he says, "They are the most acceptable to God, they are the most conducive to the grandeur and the welfare of the nation, and they are the most conducive to the honor and interests of our religion," unquote.
Well, I like the way you say that the same building could appear as a glorious temple or a Babylonic whore, depending perhaps on one's perception or one's attitude at the time. And this is something I've often tried to put across when teaching about architecture and design, that the picturesque and the sublime are in a sense two sides of the same coin, and one can stand in front of a John Vanbrugh building such as Seaton Delaval or indeed Blenheim and see it as something formal, magnificent, sublime, or one can step to the side and put a couple of cows in the foreground and suddenly it's picturesque. So nothing is ever quite as clean cut as one might hope. Your book demonstrates that the religious principles of church building were enhanced, as you say, by and contributed to scientific developments in fields outside the realm of religion, such as epistemology, the theory of sense proportion, aesthetics, rhetoric, antiquarianism, and architecture. So would you like to give some examples of that, expand on it?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I will start with a quote again, and it's one of my favorite quotes. It's one from John Gaskert, who preached the sermon for the reopening of All Hallows London in 1705, which you see a picture here. And his quote goes as follows: "We receive from our senses the ideas and notices of most things, and most of our passions derive thence, as we are affected with some objects or occurrences that first touch them, and cause such motions in our animal spirits, and so pass to our minds through them." Unquote. In this reference, John Gaskert refers to the motions caused in our animal spirits. And this strongly recalls the corpuscularian theories, like those espoused by Hobbes, for instance. According to Hobbes, sensory impressions are caused by pressure and counter-pressure, and the subsequent mediation thereof in our body and our minds. And in fact, in the book, I put several passages from Hobbes next to the passages from Gaskert's sermons, and it's really striking to see the parallels and analogies between both. And I actually always have the impression that Gaskert is almost literally quoting from Hobbes. And in that sense, Gaskert is not unique. Many preachers, certainly from the Restoration period onwards, use philosophical arguments to explain the importance and the considerable influence of sensory experience in worship. These theories on the senses developed by Hobbes, but also the ones by Locke, or the ones on the passions, as written down by Edward Reynolds or Robert Charlton, and last but not least, the aesthetic theories of the Earl of Shaftesbury became very influential in that period in the defense of the use of ornaments and, more in general, the use of art in religion and worship. The 17th century, the late 17th century preachers seem more and more to accept sensory impressions and passions as part and parcel of the human condition and also of the activity of worship. And Thomas Bis, who preached for the consecration of St. Mary Southampton in 1711, which I just quoted before, he even went further in his sermon, and he seemed to acknowledge the force of the Roman Catholic Baroque architecture. And I quote again, he says that to their glory, the beauty of these temples, though no real defense, is too real an advantage to their idolatrous worship. For as in affairs of state, likewise of the church, the opinions and the passions of men will be swayed by show and magnificence. With the advantages of these, the Popish communion thus gained many a proselyte from the Reformed. Bis thus clearly recognized the persuasive power emanating from the Roman Baroque architecture, which is of course very famous for its rhetorical persuasion and how it affected true sensory impressions and passions.
Sensory impression and passion is something that, a bit like a pendulum, swings in and out of architecture. It has done so for hundreds of years. And I think of Pugin enthusing about the need to make buildings passionate. And I think about Robert Venturi's contradiction, gosh, I can't remember the name of the book now, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, published in 1966, which again is a sort of reaction to the banality of the architecture of the previous few decades. So in a way there's nothing changes. It's just the same. Architecture is a continuum running through its various cycles. Now, this, you say, was your first monograph. So my question is, what is your next book going to be about? Where do we go from here?
Well, the initial plan was to do something on the buildings of the Chapel Royals and their foundations. But as I said at the beginning of the interview, it's quite difficult for me now to travel to the UK, unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic. So I have to look for something more nearby in Belgium. And so I decided to explore whether I can write on, let's say, the architectural testimonies or the architectural presence of Charles II in Bruges. Charles II stayed in Bruges from 1656 until 1659. And he had very good contacts with the city of Bruges and with the different guilds there. And for instance, the St. Sebastian Guild built a totally new Great Hall, which you see here, with a monumental chimney piece, which is decorated with a bust of the monarch. So I think it could be quite exciting to have a look at the architectural influence of Charles in Bruges and vice versa. And who knows, maybe I will encounter some temporary religious structure for the Chapel Royal in exile.
Okay, well, what I can say, if it's any encouragement, that should you have been able to get here, you probably wouldn't have been able to do any research, because it seems to me that all the resources are closed down, and we're all rather chomping at the bit trying to get on with our work, and we can't. So Chapels Royal might have to wait a little while, but we can look forward to your exploration of Belgian architecture, something closer to home. Anne-Francoise, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. I wish you every success in this competition, the Alice Davis Hitchcock Medallion. And of course, I have no idea who's going to win this, but thank you very much for putting your book forward. And I'm really pleased, as you might be, that it has been shortlisted. And thank you for this conversation. Goodbye.
Well, thank you for the interview, and I'm very happy to be on that very nice shortlist. So we'll see what the outcome is, but this is already a great honor for me. So thank you and goodbye.